Hey there guys, Portal Master here, and in today's video, I want to take an in-depth look at the Skylanders sales from throughout the franchise's history. Now, I touched on this very briefly in all of my brief history of Skylanders series episodes up until this point. However, I could not talk about everything in those videos, and we're going to be going very in-depth in this video. This is going to very much be a video where we talk a lot about numbers and what we can sort of gain from those numbers. So if that doesn't sound like your sort of thing, feel free to leave right now. But if you want some really in-depth analysis of these figures, and I honestly have never seen this information shared anywhere. I don't know that anyone's ever taken the time to break down this information. So strap in if that's what it sounds like. So I'm just going to dive in right now. Throughout this video, I am going to be showing you a lot of clips like this from my spreadsheet. I have compiled all of this data taken straight from VG Charts, which is a site used to track video game sales, and I have compiled them into this massive spreadsheet right here. It's not really all that massive, but it's a pretty decently sized spreadsheet for tracking Skylanders information. So, the first thing that I want to show before we dive any further into this is I just want to take one look at the total overall sales for every Skylanders game. So, as you can see right here, the games increased from Spyro's Adventure to Giants to Swap Force, and then declined into Trap Team, declined into Superchargers, and then declined further into Imaginators. Now, a quick aside. For an investor, they are not necessarily looking at the raw numbers increase from game to game. So what? The game sold 100,000 more copies than the last game. What does that actually mean to an investor? Well, it doesn't mean anything. An investor doesn't care because, say a game sold 10 million copies last time, and then it sold 1 million copies less. You might say, oh my gosh, that's a huge decline. You sold 1 million fewer games. But fundamentally, you only sold 10% less. You sold 9 million instead of 10 million. That's not actually as big of a decline as one might think. The same thing would go for this. Obviously, if you sold 10 million, saying that you sold 1 million more would mean you sold 11 million. But that's still not a huge difference. But say you only sold 1 million during a game. The next game sold 2 million. That's huge. You doubled the sales. So taking a look not necessarily at the raw numbers, but rather the percentage increase or decrease year over year is far more important than the raw numbers. So with that in mind, let's take a detailed look at the Skylanders sales. As you can see right here, here are the sales in millions. Spyro's Adventure sold 5.38 million. Giants sold 5.52 million. Swap Force sold 6.32 million. Trap Team sold 4.62 million, Superchargers sold 2.85 million, and Imaginators sold 1.95 million. Now, all of those sales numbers includes every platform that it was released on. And for Superchargers, that even includes Superchargers Racing, since I do think that it deserves to be factored in with everything else. You'll see in the column it says delta. Delta is a scientific word we use to describe change, so you can see the change in sales between every single game. Giants sold 140,000 more, Swap Force sold 800,000 more. So those were the two increases. Giants only sold a couple percent more than Spyro's Adventure. So effectively, Giants and Spyro's Adventure really did not sell different numbers in the eyes of an investor. For Swap Force, though, it did see a pretty good increase of 14.5%, which is what most investors would probably call a pretty good increase in sales. But see, then you've got to look at from Trap Team, Superchargers, and Imaginators. While Trap Team and Superchargers lost 1.7 million both times effectively, the decrease is much more noticeable going from Trap Team to Superchargers, because as you can see, instead of a 27% decline, you're looking at a 38% decline. Essentially, the decline in sales, percentage-wise, was the biggest, going from Trap Team to Superchargers. The decline, though, from Superchargers to Imaginators was just as bad as, or pretty much in the middle of those, because it still saw almost a 32% decline. It was a pretty still steep decline from the 5th to the 6th game. So understanding the fundamentals of that, the fundamentals of the base sales, is probably the most important thing we've got to talk about in this video. So there are a lot of people that sort of debate on what causes the sales to go down between the Skylanders games. A lot of people say, well, it's competition. And I have a full video that's going to actually reference a lot of the stuff in this video, talking about competition and whether or not it killed Skylanders in the near future. We're going to be looking at the sales of Disney Infinity and for LEGO Dimensions for that. So the first reason a lot of people say is because of competition. However, competition does not explain the decrease from Superchargers to Imaginators, as both LEGO Dimensions and Disney Infinity had not been released, a mainline title in over a year. So Imaginator sales were not cut into as strongly by Infinity and by Dimensions as a lot of people might think that it was. The second major reason that a lot of people would probably say a game declined is because of the previous entry. So essentially, if you didn't like the fourth Skylanders game, you probably didn't buy the fifth, which I think is true to some extent. You're like, okay, well, I hated Trap Team, but I like Swap Force, so I may or may not end up buying Superchargers, and I think that that is a reason to attribute to some of the sales decline as well. The third reason a lot of people like to say, though, is that the game looked unappealing. So, for instance, I could say, well, I bought Trap Team, but Superchargers did not look interesting to me, so I didn't buy Superchargers. And I honestly don't think that any one of those reasons can actually be used to pinpoint exactly why Skylanders declined year over year with the latter three entries, but honestly, I would say it's probably a combination of all three of those, if we're being perfectly honest. Okay, so now we've talked about the sales fundamentals. Let's talk about the console by console breakdown. Here you can see a breakdown of the sales on every console from Spyro's Adventure to Imaginators. Now, all the numbers are in a percent. So essentially, when it says Nintendo, that is the percent of the total sales of that game across all Nintendo platforms. So, for instance, like with Superchargers, that would include sales from the 3DS, from the Wii, and from the Wii U. For Sony, it's obviously the PS3 and 4, and for Xbox, it's the 360 and the Xbox One. Now, you'll probably notice something really interesting with this data. Nintendo sold the most Skylanders games on their platforms from Spyro's Adventure to Superchargers. All 5 games featured Nintendo as the #1 bestseller, and the #2 was Microsoft. As a matter of fact, for the first 5 games, Sony came in last every single time. There's a reason for this, and we'll talk about it in a minute. The exception to this, though, is Imaginators, which actually completely throws off the previous things, where we actually see Sony instead taking the #1 spot, and then Nintendo taking the #2 spot, and then you see Microsoft taking the #3 spot. Although, with Imaginators, it's probably one of the tightest overall games, with the exception of Superchargers. Let's break down what this data means. The Nintendo platforms were the #1 best-selling platform for a very, very long time. And the main reason I think for this is partly because you're throwing in the 3DS version. Essentially, I think if you control for the 3DS version, then you actually have Microsoft taking it in the Superchargers era. The reason that I say this is because I think a lot of people double-dipped with Skylanders Superchargers. A lot of them bought Racing and the regular edition at the same time. So if I owned a Wii U, I actually kind of had incentives to buy both Superchargers and Superchargers Racing, because fundamentally, they were 2 different games. And if you actually look at the data right there, Nintendo only barely is actually able to edge out Microsoft. And I think if you don't include the 3DS and you don't include the Superchargers Racing things at all, Microsoft cleanly sweeps that. So it's really interesting to look at that data. So, you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, well, I thought Nintendo was the reason that Skylanders declined. Fewer games sold on Nintendo, and we'll get to that in a moment. The second main thing that I want to talk about with this data set right here is the fact that Microsoft was the runner-up every single time. As you can see, after Nintendo followed Microsoft every single time for the first 5 games. Why was this? Well, while it is true that Xbox does not sell as well as PlayStation up until now, here's the thing. Microsoft's consoles sell way better in America than PlayStation. While worldwide, PlayStation does outsell the Xbox outsells the PlayStation in America. And Skylanders was primarily marketed in America, not in Europe, not in Australia, and not in Asia especially. So as a result, Microsoft was actually able to get more copies of Skylanders sold on their platforms than Sony and it's only for that reason. So then what's with this last data set for Imaginators? Why is that the way that it is? Well, this goes back to what I said about Superchargers. Remember how I said that if you discount the Superchargers racing, you end up with Microsoft taking it for Imaginators? You end up with most copies sold on Xboxes? Well, see, Imaginators did not have a Wii or a 3DS release, and as a result, you are able to see somebody else fall into the spotlight. But you would think, well, wouldn't that be Microsoft? Wouldn't Microsoft take it at that point? Microsoft has been the runner-up every other time, and here's why that didn't happen. Simply put, Crash Bandicoot. That is why that happened. It's really interesting because Sony and Microsoft are only ever about 3 percentage points apart in terms of sales. Every single time, Microsoft is beating Sony by only about 3%, which is enough to say that they beat them, but not by a whole lot. But Imaginators actually saw Sony beating Microsoft by a whopping 8%, which would be almost 3 times more than we saw in any other previous installment of Microsoft beating Sony. And the reason for that is simply because of Crash Bandicoot. Now, I think this raises an interesting question. Were there more PlayStation copies sold than Microsoft copies? Obviously it was because of Crash, but was it because of new fans coming in for Crash? Or was it because Xbox and PlayStation owners, people that owned both consoles, were just able to say, well, I mean, PlayStation has Crash on it, let me just get the Crash version? And personally, I think it was the second one. If you actually look at the sales decline for Imaginators, it was still about 32%, which is essentially what the previous installments had been having. This sort of, to me, tells me that not enough new fans came in for Crash Bandicoot, and that most likely what it was displaced Nintendo, and especially displaced Microsoft fans coming over and saying, well, this year I'll just get it on PlayStation. One other thing I think you should point out is that if you actually take away the Nintendo moniker and you just look at per console sales, so you actually break it down into, the Wii U, the PlayStation 3, the PlayStation 4, every single time a Nintendo console did win out in terms of overall per console sales. For the first 4 games, Spyro's Adventure to Trap Team, the Wii took it. And then for Superchargers and Imaginators, it was the Wii U. So I think that that is also an interesting thing to point out. Here are 4 statistics that I want to look at really quickly. The first one is the percent of games that were sold on the Wii. The second is the percent of them that were sold on the Wii U. The third is the percent that was sold on the Switch. And the fourth is the percentage that was sold on next generation consoles. Next generation consoles would be PS4, Xbox One, Wii U, and Nintendo Switch. You can see a very steady decrease in Wii sales between every single title. By Trap Team, the last true game to be released on the Wii, you're only seeing 20% sell-through to the Wii, and 80% of sales are actually on other consoles. You can also see how slowly the Wii U actually picked up additional membership, which is just partly due to the fact that the Wii U sold really, really poorly compared to, the Wii. Then I want you to pay attention. Look at how quickly the Nintendo Switch was able to pick up 11.79% of the total Imaginators sales. It came out at the very tail end of the Imaginators release cycle. It came out later than any of the other titles had. Like when it launched on PS4, it was a launch title, but that was still in November. Same thing for when the Wii U launched. But the Switch came out in March and still picked up that many sales of Imaginators. That's a little insane. I also think that it's not really important for drawing any conclusions, but just check out the percentage of next generation copies being sold. So, the first year obviously only includes the Wii U, which is why that number is so low. But then essentially, as soon as the PS4 and Xbox One come out, you're up to 25% sell-through, which slowly increased every year until, with Imaginators, you actually had 70% of the games being sold on next-generation consoles. But you can still see 30% of the install base is buying them on old consoles, and I just think that's interesting. So that's a lot of data. What can we take away from this information? Well, I think commonly people, for some reason, think that Skylanders largely declined because of the Wii. And I was one of those people. And I just look at this data, and that tells me that's not what happened at all. You can criticize Trap Team on the Wii's graphics all you want. The graphics were horrible, by the way. But fundamentally, Trap Team on the Wii was still a full-fledged Skylanders title, and it only had 20% of the audience at that point. And if you really look at the trends, Superchargers probably only would have sold about 12% on the Wii had the trends continued. In reality, Superchargers Racing sold about 8%. So honestly, it's not like they lost a ton of sales from Superchargers Racing. ultimately, they really only lost maybe 4% of the sales from doing that. By the time Imaginators had released, probably only 4 or 5% of people, maybe as many as 8, which is what we saw with Superchargers Racing, would have actually bought it on the Wii. But I think at that point, it would have been 2016, the Wii would have been 10 years old at that point, and most people who were playing games had probably upgraded. Another interesting thing is I think the Crash Bandicoot guest star may have actually had more influence than the Nintendo guest stars. If you actually look at the percentage of people that bought on Nintendo, the percentage is basically the same from Superchargers and Imaginators, which is almost basically 35%, which would be the lowest of the entire franchise's history was with Superchargers. And again, the Nintendo guest stars are actually interesting because they don't even work on the other consoles, so they truly were exclusive. See, at least with Crash, and Cortex, they worked on all consoles, and still, you actually see them having a greater effect. Superchargers, didn't see a boost for Nintendo consoles, but did Imaginators see a boost for Sony? Absolutely. It's the only year that they actually managed to outsell the Microsoft copies. And you can say, well, PS4 did outsell Xbox, more handily than like PS3 and Xbox 360. I don't actually even know if that's true, but that is a potential argument that people could make. But to that I say, no, that's not even accurate because Giants to Superchargers all had that, again, 3% margin between the Xbox and the Sony platforms. Like, they were basically the same every single time. So there was no gradual gaining on Microsoft. No, it was just boom. In Imaginators, Sony outsold Microsoft. To me, those are the two biggest conclusions that can be drawn out of this data. Now, I have never seen the data broken down like this before. As far as I know, this is the most in-depth analysis I've ever seen. I'm actually going to be leaving a link to the spreadsheet down in the description below if you guys are interested in looking at this data yourself. If you'd like to play around with the sales numbers, you guys can check it out. So I hope you like that. This video is getting very long, but expect to hear me reference this video in the future. If you made it to the end of this, thank you, congratulations. You seriously are amazing if you watched this whole way. I think this is really interesting. To me, this is one of the most interesting videos I've made in a long time, so I hope you guys feel the same way. Like I said, I've got a video planned talking about whether or not competition killed Skylanders, whether or not that had an effect on it, as well as a few other things that, again, will reference this video. So, again, hope you are able to come back here and enjoy this multiple times. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it all the way through. I really, really, really appreciate it. I've got a giveaway going on, so if you're interested in doing that, you can check that out on my channel. As well as that, you can go follow me on both Twitter and Instagram, and you can even join the official Skylanders Discord channel down in the description below. It's a place for fans and content creators alike to interact, and it's just a cool place to hang out. So thank you again for watching. This has been Portal Master, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks again for watching. I just wanted to take some time to thank my generous patrons on Patreon, including APYT Skylanders, Haley, Cinderclash, Adrian, OctoBoom, True Blue Dogemon, and HypnoticOcelot.